Good evening, or maybe it's good afternoon, or maybe it's good morning. Anyway, wherever you are in the world, if you're watching this, you're very welcome to our midweek show. And we've got a fantastic guest, really interesting topic to talk about. And we'll be getting to that in a minute or so. So I'll just give this a second. We are streaming. We're streaming this one in a moment of madness. I decided to let it go out on YouTube. Hello, YouTube. Hello, censors on YouTube. So we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're on Getter, we're on Rumble, we're on Twitter, we're also live. Actually, we're streaming this live to my podcast platform as well. So hello to the folks who listen over there. Because you know the one advantage you have if you listen, you don't have to put up with my mugshot. So I mean that might be a very wise move. But anyway, regardless of which, wherever you are, thanks very, very much for being here. Uh, just a few little things before we go live, we get into our topic. I will be on revealing full details of our London show. We've got a live London show on January the 30th. I've told you to put it all in your diaries. Start the new year the best way. We're going to have a really good night with some very eminent guests at a particular location in London, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So please put January the 30th in your diary, and I'll get you all the details in the next couple of days. It's everything's basically in place. So just to tease that one. Hello, Chris Davies. Good to see you there as well. And you know, the Chinese curses. You know, may you live in interesting times. Well, we certainly do live in turbulent times. And but yet, you know, when you go back through the sweep of history, the arc of history, things have always been turbulent. You know, it's just that in the moment it seems so much different. But I want to talk tonight about a particular moment in history, which is concerning the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which I'm urging all my British viewers as well as my US viewers pay attention to this one, because our guest this evening, he's been with me before. I really enjoyed talking to him. He's a fantastic author, really produces an enormous body of work, actually, a lot of which I have read. And so therefore, I'm delighted to reintroduce you to Mr. James Perloff. James, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much, David, for having me back on the show.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure. You know, as we were saying before we came on air, it was June when we spoke last, and we tackled the topic of the sinking of the Lusitania, and tonight we're going to talk about momentous moment in history, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But just before we get to that, James, if I can just ask you, you know, as we send this out across the airwaves. November 20th, we have kind of perilous times. We have sort of certainly the Ukrainian situation with Russia seems to have been ratcheted up by, I assume, the deep state, as far as I can see, in your neck of the woods, UK joining in, long-range ballistic missiles being sent. And I just wonder, James, you know, I mean, obviously you watch this going on. What's your thoughts?
Well, I expressed those in an email I sent out to my email list this morning. 2 days ago, Joseph Biden, the lame duck president of the United States, authorized Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into Russia. And in fact, yesterday, as we're recording this, Ukraine did send 6 long-range missiles attacking Russia. What's important to know about this is that these missiles are made in America. They can only be launched by American technicians. The Ukrainians certainly don't have the technology for this, and the authorization has come from the U.S. president. So this is an act of war by the United States president against Russia. Now, I want to point out that the American Constitution says that only Congress has the ability to make war. Congress is in recess right now, as
Yep.
many people know. However, uh, the President Joe Biden, who is obviously incapable of making these decisions, who is quite senile, and is being given his directions by handlers whose names we don't know, has
Mm.
authorized the launch of these missiles into Russia. Um, this is a risk of nuclear war.
Yeah.
It is very, very dangerous. And so I sent out an email to my email list this morning encouraging people. I'm not a big believer in U.S. Congress. They're many of them are bought and paid for, but I'm just encouraging people to write to congressmen for the United States legislature to exert its constitutional authority to um, be the only ones who can start a war. Joe Biden does not have that authority. Needs to be restrained. Even his own party, the Democratic Party, refused to allow him to run for reelection on the grounds that he was mentally
Yeah.
incompetent. How, therefore, can be competent to oversee World War III, a potential nuclear war? So I'm encouraging all of my American listeners, and I know that there's probably a minority of your listeners, but I'm encouraging all of our American listeners to contact their congressmen and senators, as I did this morning, through their local and Washington offices, to ask them to please halt this, to get Joe Biden to rescind the order, to halt the attack of Russia by U.S. missiles, which could lead to utter disaster for the entire world if this becomes a nuclear conflict. It's very, very important. And well, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, further to what you've said, James, the UK has also given permission for UK manufactured Storm Shadow, I think, missiles to also be fired. I mean, just the final bit before we get to your book, there's this window we've got, isn't it, between now and January 20th, the inauguration of President Trump. And it's like a dark period because it's like there's like one more heave to try and get this incredible global conflagration. And you got to wonder about it's. I mean, it's not Joe Biden making these decisions. Clearly,
Right.
it's as you say, it's anonymous people in the background, in the shadows, and they seem to have. Oh, I don't know, like I mean, I don't recall moments like this happening throughout my life where there seemed to be an enthusiasm for a nuclear war, which is we all lose, and it just makes you wonder about James, the people in the shadows who seem to be quite happy with that.
Yes, I would think that our here in America, our congressmen and senators would not be happy with that because they know that it's disaster for the whole world, including
Yeah,
America. I don't know how anyone could think that a nuclear war between America and Russia would be positive, unless you think that you've got some specialist, underground escape
yeah,
arrangement, some insane arrangement. But it's going to be destructive of the whole world. I hope that there are enough senators and congressmen in the United States Capitol who are willing to oppose this and are willing to um, uh, uh, combine with each other and
mhm,
confront Joe Biden and demand that this order be rescinded.
mm,
Um, it needs to be done. It's terrifying for the whole world to have to
yeah,
contemplate a nuclear um, war for a cause that obviously the United States instigated in the first place when we overthrew the
yeah,
elected president of the Ukraine and replaced him with Zelensky. Our interference with Ukrainian politics goes back many years. It's insane.
yeah, it is.
Um,
Yeah,
it is totally insane, and I hope that people will follow through and amongst my American followers and contact their congressmen and senators, as I did this morning, and or urge them to um, prohibit
mhm,
the president from continuing this order and ask him to rescind it.
yeah. Okay. Well, look. I mean, as I said, we started with the serious matters concerning this this kind of on the brink almost of some kind of global war. But what we're going to do tonight, James, I really enjoyed our last conversation we had on the events leading up to the sinking of the Lusitania and how
Mm.
incredibly convenient that turned out for certain people. And tonight, I wanted to talk about this, and this is, folks, this is James's book. Exploding, yeah, there we go. Bring it up on screen, but I do have it. Exploding the official myths of the Lincoln assassination. And I think, James, am I right in thinking this book came out during the summer months? It's reasonably recent, isn't it?
Yeah, it came out in July. Yeah.
Yeah, just after you'd been on with me. Yeah, yeah. So, well, listen. What this is an education job we have now embarked upon, James, because you're speaking to, well, my audience is kind of global, but there's a big British element to it, and I guess a lot of us would understand the, let's call it the official narrative, for what happened that night back in April of 1865. So, can we start off, just if you could just summarize what we've all been told happened, and then we'll talk about, as per your book, what actually did happen. So let's start off with start it easy, okay? Tell us the official narrative. What happened?
Okay. That is a very logical place to begin. Um, this will be familiar to some American listeners and probably unfamiliar to some European listeners. But the story of the Lincoln assassination officially is
Officially.
this. On April the 9th, 1865,
Yep.
General Robert E. Lee, the chief commander of Confederate Southern forces, there'd been a ongoing civil war um, for several years between the North and the South. General Lee surrendered to USS Grant, the commander of the Union forces, April the 9th, 1865. And then 5 days later, April the 14th, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Now, during the third act, at about 10:15 p.m., a known Southern sympathizer, uh, the actor John Wilkes Booth, very famous actor. Lincoln had seen him perform at Ford's Theater,
Hmm.
uh, but he sneaked into the presidential box and he assassinated the president with a shot to the back of the head. Now, General Grant, the victorious commander, was supposed to be there that night, sitting in the presidential box with his wife, but they canceled out at the last minute. And so, as a substitute, the Lincolns brought some friends of theirs, Major Henry uh, Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris, who was the daughter of the U.S. Senator from New York.
Hmm.
Um, After the shot was fired, Major Rathbone sprang to his feet and he grappled with John Wilkes Booth, but Booth stabbed him with a Bowie knife, inflicted a very deep wound, and Booth escaped onto the stage below. But ironically, he was wearing riding boots with spurs because he wanted to make his getaway on a horse.
Yeah.
His spur caught on the American flag draping the ledge, and he fell so awkwardly that he broke his leg. Yet this did not prevent him from rising up and exclaiming to the audience, which is over 1,500 people, the state motto of Virginia, and exclaiming that the South is avenged. And before anybody could really react, he made his way out the rear entrance to the theater onto a horse and made his getaway. Now, one thing that many people don't remember about this is that a simultaneous assassination attempt was made against the Secretary of State, William Seward,
Hmm.
one
Yeah.
of Booth's accomplices, named Lewis Powell, entered Seward's home, and the Secretary of State was bedridden from a very, very serious carriage accident. Um, Powell stabbed him several times in his bed, and he was not expected to live, but he did. In the meantime, John Wilkes Booth, the presidential assassin, is making his way south with a riding companion named David Harold. Now, Booth's broken leg is killing him, and he diverted many miles off course to meet a country doctor who he knew slightly, named Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd made a homemade cast
Yeah.
for the fractured leg after reducing the fracture. And after resting a few hours at the doctor's home, Booth continued his escape, but he was really slowed down by this broken leg. And 12 days after the assassination, April 26, 1865, he was confronted in a barn in Virginia by a Union U.S. government cavalry
Mhm.
detachment. And his riding companion, David Harold, surrendered, but Booth refused to come out. And Booth, against orders, was shot by one of the soldiers through an opening in the barn, and he was mortally wounded and died after about 3 hours.
Mm.
That basically closes the case, except for a couple of things. Um, 8 of Booth's alleged accomplices were tried by a military tribunal who found all guilty. 4 were hanged, and 4 were sentenced to
Yeah.
hard labor in prison at a very remote prison in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's one thing I have to mention. We may not even get into this tonight, but it is relevant. Is that Booth's original plan was not to kill President Lincoln. His original plan had been to kidnap the president. In March of 1865, on March the 17th, he and 7 accomplices were waiting on a deserted stretch of road for the presidential carriage to come by, and they were intending, with a very well planned plan, to seize the president's carriage, kidnap him, bring him south, in the hopes that by holding him as a hostage in the south, they could exchange him for the release of a large number of Confederate prisoners of war. This sort of a last ditch effort to save the Confederacy.
Mm.
Um, that fits into the narrative and is part of the mainstream narrative, and that
Yeah.
is basically the mainstream narrative of the Lincoln assassination, but it's full of holes, and we can start on those holes anytime you'd like.
Well, let's do that because I have to say, James, what I enjoyed so much about you, well, this book, but actually all of the stuff that you do, and that's why I love talking to you. It's really well researched. You've gone into, so much background, uh, and essentially, I mean, as you've entitled this "Exploding the Official Myths," and we do know one thing that we did talk about the last time when we agreed upon is, I mean, I'm of the view nowadays that pretty much everything that you think you know about history, you really want to have a second look at it
Right.
because, you know, I mean, when it comes to the assassination of presidents, we only have to go back to 1963 to realize that. I think there's a kind of a theme here. So let's bring it back then to 1865, and so that's what you've just sort of told us, the official narrative. Let's start now and talk through about really what you discovered, what you started to find when you looked into the so-called official story.
Okay. The first thing is, why did President Grant cancel out on attending Ford's Theater with President Lincoln?
Yeah.
Um, President Grant gave his official reason is that he wanted to visit his family in New Jersey, and in fact, when the president was shot, uh, uh, General
Mhm.
Grant was on a train to New Jersey that evening. However, um, as Otto Eisenschmidt, who in 1937 wrote the definitive book, as far as I'm concerned, on the truth about the Lincoln assassination, um, pointing out that there was no urgency for Grant to visit his family. He just as easily could have taken the morning train
Mm.
and obeyed the request from the president.
Mm.
But he did not show up that night. And what you're going to find is that mainstream historians have put their own spin on every aspect of the Lincoln assassination. So what they say about General Grant is that his wife Julia did not get along well with President Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln,
Yeah.
and that she pressured her husband not to go to the theater that night. Um, that does not make sense because all the Grants were requested to do was to sit in the presidential box in full view of the public. That is not going to result in a battle between the two women.
Mm.
Um, it's not going to happen that way. The true reason why Grant canceled out was that he went to the War Department and he met with the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who
Yeah.
we're going to
Yeah.
find is the main character in orchestrating the assassination. Uh, Stanton told Grant, "You should not go to Ford's Theater tonight. It would be extremely dangerous." And based upon that advice, Grant canceled out. But
Mm.
Grant's attitude towards President Lincoln was very sharply in contrast. I want to quote, as I do in
Yeah.
my book, Lincoln's daytime bodyguard, William Crook. He wrote in his memoirs, quote, "I was surprised when on the afternoon of the 14th, that's the day of the assassination, I accompanied Mr. Lincoln in a hurried visit to the War Department. I found that the president was more depressed than I'd ever seen him, and his step was unusually slow. Mr. Lincoln said to me, 'Crook, do you not believe there are men who want to take my life?' Then, after a pause, he said, 'And I have no doubt that they will do it.' The conviction with which he spoke this made me. I wanted to protest, but by his tone being so calm and sure, I found myself saying instead, 'Why do you think so, Mr. President? Other men have been assassinated,' was his reply. All I could think to say was, 'I hope you're mistaken, Mr. President.'" End
Mm.
quote. Now, Crook stood outside the War Department while Lincoln went in, and we do have the details of what happened from David Homer Bates, who worked in the War Department at that time. Lincoln went into the War Department, and uh, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, advised Lincoln not to go to Ford's Theater, but not with the same urgency that he had General Grant.
Mm.
And Abraham Lincoln said to the Secretary of War, Stanton, "I'd like to bring a reliable bodyguard tonight. I want your assistant, Major Thomas Eckert. I know he's very strong. I've seen him break iron pokers over his arm."
Mm.
So um, Stanton said to Lincoln, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, I can't spare Major Eckert. We're going to have a very busy night tonight in the War Department." Lincoln did not accept this. He went directly to Major Eckert, who was in charge of the cipher desk, meaning the telegraph desk,
Yeah.
which was in charge of the War Department at that time. And he asked him, "Major Eckert, would you please be my bodyguard tonight at Ford's Theater?" Major Eckert said, "Sorry, Mr. President, I'm too busy." Now, there are two things to know about this. Number
Mm.
one, it is very unusual for a major in the United States Army to refuse a request from the commander of the chief,
Yeah.
the President of the United States. Number two, um, both Eckert and Stanton were lying to Abraham Lincoln. They were not busy in the War Department. They were not even in the War Department that evening. By his own admission,
Mhm.
Stanton, not knowing this would later be discredited, went home, had dinner at home as usual, and he was still at home when the news of the president's assassination was announced, and Major Eckert was not even in the War Department either. He signed off his death to his assistant, David Homer Bates. Um, so they're both lying. Now, again, the mainstream historians have a spin on everything. They
Okay.
say that the reason that the Eckert and Stanton lied to President Lincoln was that they were so concerned about his safety. They thought that if they denied him the protection he wanted at Ford's Theater, to which he just
Okay.
mind, but he didn't change his mind. Right there and then, he said, "I'm still going to Ford's Theater. I'll take Major Rathbone instead." If
Mm.
they were really concerned about the president's safety, they would have backed off and said, "Okay, you can have Major Eckert," but they did not. So they are lying. And then I have a section of my book. It's called "The Worst Bodyguard Ever." Who
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
president's bodyguard that night? It was his bodyguard was John F. Parker. Now, John F. Parker was a member of the Washington Metropolitan Police. He'd been charged with misconduct many times for being drunk on duty, being asleep on duty, for
Yeah.
using foul language, for visiting a brothel. But somehow he always got off his charges. And what's very important to know is that he deserted his post. As the play began, he did what he should have done. He stood outside the presidential box at Ford's
Yeah.
Theater. Um, but then he deserted his post and he went next door to the Star Saloon and began boozing it up. And he was not at his post when Lincoln was assassinated. And I
So,
just want to
so
quote
he,
what you,
yeah.
oh,
So
go ahead.
he went for a drink then. He decided to go for a drink.
He decided to boost it up instead of protecting the president. Now, what William Crook, who I
Yeah.
previously quoted as the daytime bodyguard, said this about Parker. Uh, he said he should have been at the rear of the presidential box, quote, fully armed, and to permit no unauthorized person to pass. Incredible as it may seem, he quietly deserted his post of duty. It's through this guard's amazing recklessness, to use no stronger words, that Booth accomplished his foul deed, end quote. Um, so you would think that John F. Parker, for deserting his post as Lincoln's bodyguard, would have been punished, probably thrown in jail, certainly
Mm.
would have lost his job. But no, he was not imprisoned. He did not lose his job. He remained on the presidential bodyguard detail even after letting the president be assassinated. And when the president, Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, saw him still coming to the White House, she screamed that he was responsible for her husband's death. Now, I will grant that Mary Todd Lincoln was a high-strung woman, but she was correct. John F. Parker's desertion of his post resulted in the president's assassination, and yet he was not punished. Now, in case people think that um, people were just lenient in the aftermath of the president's death, let me point out that the man who took charge of the presidential assassination was the same man who denied him protection that night at Ford's Theater, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton.
Yeah. He was a
Now,
key.
Edwin Stanton should not have been in charge of the investigation. John Wilkes Booth was a civilian, the president was a civilian, Ford's Theater was a civilian environment. But
Mm.
Edwin Stanton untruthfully said that this was a plot of the Confederate Southern government,
Mm.
therefore it was an act of war. Therefore,
Mm.
he said it's under my authority, and he took complete charge of the assassination investigation. That just to give you a contrast
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
treatment that was given to John F. Parker, the bodyguard who was completely let off the hook, never punished, never reprimanded in any way. Um, there were people who had no connection to the assassination who were ruthlessly treated. And as an example of this, I want to give the example of Ned Spangler. Ned Spangler worked at Ford's Theater as a scene shifter, meaning he would shift the scenery between
Blackmail.
acts,
Yeah.
and he would,
Yeah.
when the curtain was down, and he was also a carpenter. And what happened with this crime on the night of the assassination, John Wilkes Booth made his getaway not on a horse that he owned; it was a rented horse, and the owner of the stable, named John Pemfrey, warned Booth, "This is a very high-spirited horse; it might break away on you." Now, John Wilkes Booth wanted to make sure that horse was waiting for him when he made his getaway. So he knew Spangler not as a co-assassin, he simply knew Spangler as an employee of Ford's Theater because
Yeah.
John Wilkes Booth often was engaged as an actor at Ford's Theater. So said, Spangler, would you hold this horse for a couple of minutes? I need to go into the theater. So Spangler obliged him, not knowing anything about the assassination. And but after a couple of minutes, he looked at his watch and he said, I've got to get back into the theater to shift scenery.
Yeah.
So he asked a fellow employee named Joseph Burroughs to hold the horse for Booth. He then went back into the theater. That's it. That's the extent of his involvement in
Involvement.
the
Yeah, yeah,
he did not discuss the assassination with John Booth. There's no evidence that he did. There's no evidence that he knew any of Booth's accomplices. But
yeah.
Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, ordered Spangler to be arrested, and for weeks on end, he was placed in solitary confinement with a hood over his head. He
Mm,
had to wear this canvas hood over his head at all times. His legs were shackled, his hands were handcuffed. Even during meals, he could not have this hood removed. And he was forbidden to speak to the guards, but the guards, out of pity, one would stand watch and the other would feed him through the small hole in this canvas hood. And this went on for weeks on end.
yeah,
This is a complete violation of the U.S. Bill of Rights, which forbids cruel and unusual
yeah,
punishment. The wearing of
yeah,
these canvas hoods, which was applied to all of Booth's accomplices, with the exception of the one woman who was eventually hung,
yeah.
Mary Surratt. She was handcuffed but not required to wear the hood. This is a complete violation of the U.S. Constitution. Um, this is as we look at the Lincoln assassination, we're going to find that people who had nothing to do with the assassination were ruthlessly punished, hung, or sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. But
Yeah,
people who were directly related to the assassination were let off with no punishment whatsoever.
yeah, which is and it's remarkable. I mean, and just in terms of that unusual, cruel and unusual treatment, like to put that hood over the guy's head, and for that to be permanently on his, to have to wear that 24/7, it's incredible that for doing nothing, he did nothing, as far as I can see from what you've presented, apart from what you've outlined. So it's weird. So the people who did bad things, everything's fine. People who didn't do anything, yeah, James, that I'm beginning to smell something a bit strange about this one. Yeah, so let's carry on. So okay,
Mm.
so what then happened? Oh, by the way, James, I don't know if it's possible, but just behind you, I think the sun is shining. You must be having sunshine where you are, but there's
Oh, I'm
a
sorry. Let me try to move my head. I don't think I can go back and adjust the
if
blinds,
you
but let me
yeah,
move my head to try
keep your head there. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
to
so we don't
cut
get
out
yeah,
the shining of those blinds. They're
yeah,
kind of hard to close completely.
no problem.
Um,
Carry on then. So
um,
let's keep going.
let's carry on with the Lincoln assassination.
Yes.
Um, John Wilkes Booth. There's some very unusual circumstances. He entered the presidential box with two weapons: a one-shot Derringer pistol. He had one bullet and a knife.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, how
Yeah.
was it that John Wilkes Booth was so confident he
That
would
one bullet.
only need
Yeah.
one bullet to
Yeah.
kill the president? No mainstream historian, to my knowledge, has ever asked this question. But we must ask it. Why did he know he only needed one
Yeah.
bullet? And I'm going to say right here and now that the answer is that he knew the president would be without a bodyguard. All of Lincoln's bodyguards were equipped with 38 Colt revolvers. If
Hmm.
Booth had been required to use that one bullet he had to take out the bodyguard, he would have had to use his knife to kill President Lincoln. But
Yeah.
first, he would have to get through Major Rathbone. And by the time he did that, you can be sure that many rescuers would have been into the presidential
Yeah.
box.
Stop him.
And
Yeah.
the president himself was a very strong man, 6 foot 4 inches tall. He used to be a railroad splitter in his youth. Very strong. John Wilkes Booth, only 5 foot 8. He could not really have just killed the president with a knife. Um, so he had to be sure he only needed one bullet. And this indicates he had inside information that the president's bodyguard would desert his post
Yeah.
shortly before the assassination. Now, if people don't think that John Wilkes Booth had inside information, I'm going to prove it right now. I mentioned before that the Secretary of State, I think I mentioned this, um, the Secretary of State, William Seward, was also the victim of an assassination that attempt tonight. Maybe we didn't. Do we
Yeah, we didn't
mention this
touch
or
on that.
not?
No, no.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I've done a lot of shows on this. Um, One other assassination attempt was carried out simultaneous to the Lincoln assassination. It was on the Secretary of State William Seward by one of Booth's accomplices
Yeah,
named
yeah,
Powell. And Powell entered the Secretary of State's home. The Secretary of State was bedridden due to a serious carriage accident. Powell stabbed him several times in his bed. He was not expected to survive his wounds, but he did. And uh, but to get into the secretary's home, he told the servant that he was a pharmacy delivery boy. He said, "I've got medication for the secretary's
yeah.
physician, Doctor Verity." He knew exactly where the staircase was. He knew exactly where Secretary of State Seward's bedroom was on the third floor. He
Uh-huh.
obviously had a lot of inside information. Booth and his accomplices had inside information. Um, this is proof that the conspiracy was more than simply a group of assassins who randomly attempted to kill the president and his secretary of state. Now, this is very important to mention. Very important. The um, After the war, the South was subject to economic exploitation.
Yeah.
This is called the Reconstruction period. It lasted for 12 years. For 12 years, the people of the South were not allowed to elect their own governors. They were under military dictators
Hmm.
appointed by the War Department. Many people lost their homes due to onerous taxation. You can see this in the movie Gone with the Wind when Scarlett O'Hara has these
Yeah.
impossible taxes imposed on her property. And they seized businesses. They seized 2 million bales of cotton. The South was totally exploited. Now, Abraham Lincoln stood in the way of this. Abraham Lincoln had been a dictator during the war. He put
Mm, yeah,
many
yeah,
congressmen and newspapers in prison for opposing his policies. But by the end of the war, he'd grown sick of it. He said, I want, in his second inaugural address in 1865, March. He said, "We want malice towards none, charity towards all. We
yeah.
want the South to be treated with respect. We want them restored to the Congress." Now, the members of his own party, the what we'll call the radical Republicans, were opposed to this. They realized that if the Southern Democrats united with the Northern Democrats, they would outvote the Northern radical Republicans who represented the deep state of that era, the deep
Right.
state of that era. And they realized that to do this, they needed to eliminate Abraham Lincoln. And as proof of
Yeah.
this, I just want to mention that Abraham Lincoln's death was mourned in the South. Jefferson Davis said, quote, "It would be disastrous for our people." Robert E. Lee, the commander of Southern forces, condemned it. And a long time ago, I read the diary of Sarah Morse Morgan Dawson. In her diary, which is 440 pages long, it closed with these words, quote, "Our Confederacy is gone with one crash, the report of the pistol fired at Lincoln," end quote. Now, if you go on YouTube, I think you can see it for free on YouTube. There was a movie made in 1915 called Birth of a Nation. It's very pro-Confederate. It's pro-Confederate because that was the year the Lusitania went down. They wanted Southerners to start fighting with Northerners alongside them in World War One. This is the same reason why Gone with the Wind came out in 1939, the year that World War II began. They wanted Southerners to give up their hatred of the Northerners and fight with them in foreign wars.
Mm, mm.
Hollywood always does things for a reason.
Yes, we
Um,
know. Yeah,
but
yeah,
it was only in the North that the death of Lincoln was celebrated. And to prove that, I'm going to quote the diary of radical Republican Congressman George Julian on April the 15th, just hours after Lincoln died. He
yeah.
wrote this quote, I like the radicalism of the members of this caucus, but have not for a long time heard so much profanity. It became disgusting. The hostility toward Lincoln's policy of reconciliation and contempt for his weakness were undisguised, and the universal feeling among radical men is his death is a godsend. It really seems so, from one of the last acts of his official life was an invitation of some of the chief rebel conspirators, meaning the South, to meet in Richmond and confer with us on the subject of peace, end quote. So Lincoln's death was celebrated in the North, but was mourned in the South, the exact
Yeah.
opposite of what you would expect. It was the North, now I'm not saying the Northern people or the average citizen, but it
Mm.
was the government people in the North who plotted Lincoln's death.
Yeah, I think we're just showing on screen "Birth of a Nation." That's if you want to, folks, check this out later. You can do it there. It's available, as James said, on YouTube. Yeah. So yeah. So that's a kind of a contradiction, isn't it? So sort of his death is mourned in the South, but celebrated by these radical Republicans. You really saying they were the deep state of their time in the
Quite.
18th century. Yeah, yeah,
It's important for people to remember too that the Republican and Democratic parties of that era were almost the reverse of those parties today. In those days,
mm,
it was the Republicans who were pro-Marxist and in favor of dismantling the Constitution, and it was the Democrats who were quite conservative, very much the opposite of what we see today.
yeah,
Today, it's quite the opposite. The Democratic Party has become the a place of AOC and the transgender advocating
yeah,
wild-minded left, and the Republican Party, despite the rhinos who, of course, the
yeah,
Republicans in name only,
yeah,
who I
yeah,
object to, are advocating more sanity. But in those days, it was quite the opposite.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so Lincoln's been he's been shot, he's dead, and John Wilkes Booth. Then, so talk us through then. So he obviously tried to get away. Um, how did that actually happen, James? This escape that he tried to do, and
Well,
what's the real story there behind him?
I'm so glad you asked this. I'm not going to go into the details, but
About-
Ford's theater was modified in several ways to facilitate the assassination. You'll find that in my book
Yeah,
on the Lincoln assassination. But
yeah,
right after John Wilkes Booth escaped, a couple of things happened. Number one, all of the telegraph wires around Washington shut down.
yeah. That
Now,
was
who
weird. Yeah. Mm,
was in charge of the telegraph wires? It was Major Thomas Eckert, the same man who refused to be Lincoln's bodyguard that night at Ford's Theater. And if you follow his career,
mm,
following
mm.
Lincoln's assassination, he was made Assistant Secretary of War. And after he left the government, he rose um, rapidly through the telegraph industry and became chairman and president of Western Union. This is the most powerful
Yeah.
communication system that existed in that day, the telegraph. There were no telephones yet, obviously, no email. It's like
Huh.
being chairman of Microsoft or um, Facebook. He became chairman and president of both. You have to have powerful people behind you to get these positions.
Mm,
Something else to understand about this um, is that Stanton put himself in charge of the investigation. Again, this
yeah.
fell under the authority of the Attorney General, but Stanton falsely claimed it was an act of war by the
Yeah.
Confederacy, put
Yeah.
himself in charge. And Booth's escape from Washington is very interesting because he escaped across. To escape from Washington, you had to go across the Potomac River. There are
Yeah.
several bridges, and Booth was able to get across the bridge in spite of the fact that there was a strict military order that no one should cross the
Yes.
bridge
That's
after
right.
9 p.m.
Yeah.
Now, Booth didn't arrive until about 10:30 p.m., nor did his riding companion, David Harold. Now, the sergeant in charge of the bridge let them both pass, both of them claimed they had to get home, and mainstream
Mm.
historians will just say, well, the sergeant in charge was just being kind. But we have to ask ourselves why it was that, just like John F. Parker, the bodyguard, why was it
Mm.
the sergeant who let these men escape from Washington, the two presidential assassins, why was he never punished? Why was he not court-martialed? He allowed them to escape in
Yep.
violation of standing military orders. And the orders are very strict that no one could pass these bridges after 9 p.m. without a pass or a password, which suggests that John Wilkes Booth and his writing companion David Harold either had a password or that some kind of fix was put in the bridge. But the main thing is that the sergeant in charge of the bridge was never punished, just like Lincoln's bodyguard. I also have to mention this, that John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed at a farm in
Yeah.
Virginia, one of our
Yeah.
southern states, against orders. He was supposed to return. It's very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way.
Yes, that's the
Shot and
obvious one. Yeah. Yeah.
shot and killed before he could return for trial. John Wilkes Booth was shot in violation of military orders to bring him back alive. The soldier who shot him, no officer in that company verified it. We only have his word for it that he shot Booth. Um, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it was actually shot by the commander in chief of the cavalry detachment,
Yeah.
um, which I go into in my book.
Yes.
But when he was returned to Washington, the soldier whose name was Boston Corbett, he was supposed to be court-martialed, but Secretary of War Stanton, who was so involved with this whole process,
Yes.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, simply announced that. Let's see if I can find the quote. Um, or here's the quote. He said, "quote The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has saved us continual excitement, delay, and expense. The patriot is released." So the Secretary of War um, let this soldier off, even though he's violated military orders by
Yeah.
shooting John Wilkes Booth. Now, what this does, and this is important for people to understand, there was no trial investigating what really happened at the farm, what really happened,
Mm.
um, which would have been very important. Witnesses would have been called uh, to prove whether or not this man really fired the shot, what really happened at the farm. But instead, um, by the Secretary of War's orders, this man was simply released, and there was no investigation that took place. And this is very similar to the guard at the bridge who was let off the hook, very similar to Lincoln's bodyguard who deserted his post, was let off the hook. Everybody who's important in letting this plot proceed is let off the hook. And I just want to mention
Mm.
that these details were discussed in an NBC documentary that aired on Lincoln's birthday, April the 12th, 1971.
Mm.
It was nominated for an Emmy. It was made by David Wolper Productions, one of the most. They produced Roots and many other eminent productions, over 200. They produced a production which accused Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, of orchestrating Lincoln's assassination.
Mm.
You can
Mm.
still see that on YouTube. I linked to it from my book, both from the Kindle version and the paperback version. But they raise the same questions I'm asking now. These are not crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy questions. They ask, why is it that Stanton left that road that John Wilkes Booth took unpatrolled? Why is it that the telegraph wires all went down right after Lincoln's
Yeah.
assassination?
Yeah.
Why is it that Stanton denied Lincoln the protection he wanted at Ford's Theater? Why is it that so many key documents disappeared from War Department files? Uh, you can still see that documentary on YouTube, yet mainstream historians today will tell you that it's a crazy, nut um,
Yeah.
tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. It was not considered a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory in 1937 when Otto Eisenschemel revealed these facts that I'm discussing with you now. And that was a selection of the Book of the Month Club, which, by the way, had about 1 million subscribers. You had to be a very good book to get into the Book of the Month Club. And in 1971, the NBC mainstream network raised these questions. And yet, all of this is forgotten today. And I'm just, in my book, I'm trying to bring these facts forward to this generation so that they can see that Abraham Lincoln's assassination was the work of the War Department and Edwin Stanton. It was not the work of the South, as is claimed today. There was some act of vengeance for the North winning the war. It was done to get Lincoln out of the way and Seward, his Secretary of State. These are the only two men in the entire Lincoln cabinet who opposed the plan of Reconstruction. They're the only two people who assassination attempt were actually carried out upon on the night of the assassination. This was an attempt to get rid of those who opposed Reconstruction. It had nothing to do with the South. They were not behind the plan. This is a plan originated by the deep state of the North.
Well, I mean, just as you explain that, James, the thing that all I'm thinking in my head is, and then when we got to Dallas in 1963, there's so many similarities, and obviously the whole conspiracy theory rhetoric was put in place by the three-letter agencies in the aftermath of that, because then, I mean, even back in late in November, December 63, there were some questions being asked, and so they shut it down. So there does seem to be this reoccurring thread through American history, where when presidents become inconvenient, bad things happen.
Right. Lincoln had been a dictator during the war, but he did soften his attitude towards the South for the aftermath of the war, and that's why it had to be taken out. But you're right, there are a lot of coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy. Now, they were both elected in a year ended in 1860 and 1960. They both had vice presidents named Johnson. They were both assassinated by gunshots to the head. They were both killed while sitting right next to their wives. And in both cases, the alleged assassin was killed before being brought to trial. And actually, there's a book, I don't even own it, but there is a book that goes into all the coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy's death. I have to think that this is not really intentional, but I think on a spiritual level, there is some synchronicity between what happened to Lincoln and it happened to John F. Kennedy. Synchronicity.
I would agree with that. I think at that spiritual level, there's something there. But I mean, obviously, the murder of. Okay, here's another book, Lincoln. I think that might be the book actually, Lincoln and Kennedy.
Probably,
but the thing is, like, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it was a momentous moment in American history. I mean, it still carries an echo. The brutality of it, the shock of it, and it did change American history, didn't it?
Oh yes, it changed the course of what happened to the South after the war. I think that's the most important factor. There's one thing too I want to mention about Lincoln's assassination, which is really important for people to know. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, and he was the assassin. I don't think anybody questions that truth. He was witnessed by so many people, but he had a diary, and he had this diary on him when he was shot and mortally wounded. And what's important to know is that the diary was not revealed in court. In the courtroom, here's the evidence that was introduced. It was found on John Wilkes Booth: his knife, his pistols, his belt, his holster, his file, his compass, spur, tobacco pipe, carbon, cartridges, and bills of exchange, which came from a bank. Yet his diary was excluded from the evidence, and nobody knew that it existed. It was not until 1867, 2 years later,
Mm.
that the diary was known about. The reason that happened was that Edwin Stanton, who had been in charge of the Lincoln investigation, had a falling out with the head of the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker. Now, Baker went rogue and he published his own book called The History of the Secret Service. In that book, he revealed that John Wilkes Booth kept a diary. Now, this shocked the American public and the
Mm.
Congress because nobody knew about it before. And the diary was subpoenaed by Congress. And what Congress found was that 18 pages were missing from that diary. Um,
Yeah.
I just want to quote the Congressman Benjamin Butler. He made a very good point. He said, quote, what I want to know is this. It was the good judgment on the gentleman prosecuting the assassins to put in evidence the tobacco pipe, spur, and compass found in Booth's pocket. Why not then the diary in his own handwriting in the same pocket put in evidence? End
Yeah.
quote. Now, um, it was not 18 pages missing. Now, in 1977, a lot of people don't know this, the FBI's forensic laboratory was asked to investigate John Wilkes Booth's diary. There are two reasons for this. Number one, the
Mm.
diary was starting to fall apart. It was not going to be possible for people to look at it much longer. But
Yeah.
also, some scholars believe there was secret handwriting in the diary. And it turned out that there was no secret handwriting. But I quote the FBI report, which you can read online, by the way, um, in my book. And what the FBI says is, quote, in total, there are 43 full sheets, 86 pages, because each page has two,
Okay.
each sheet has 2 pages, okay, missing from the diary. And the FBI found that the 27 pages immediately preceding the assassination were missing from John Wilkes Booth's diary. And just as Congress had noted, more than 100 years old before this, you could see on the pages that had been cut out the remnants of John Wilkes Booth's writing, a word or a punctuation mark.
Yeah.
These
In
were
the end.
not
Yeah.
just blank pages. Somebody wanted these pages removed, and a total of 86 pages were removed from the diary. Now, you can go online and look for John Wilkes Booth diary. You'll see a very abbreviated form of what he actually wrote. And these are the pages that the Edwin Stanton and the War Department wanted the people to see.
Yeah.
But by
Yeah.
removing 86 pages, this is very, very significant. This was obstruction of justice. Now, mainstream historians continue to try to defend this. I'm going to say it right here and right now that the exclusion of John Wilkes Booth's diary from the trial of his alleged co-conspirators was obstruction of justice. There are people who were sentenced to death or to life imprisonment at
Mm.
that trial who could have been proven innocent by that diary because the diary revealed that there was no plot to assassinate President Lincoln until the day of the assassination. Now, the people who were convicted at the trial, who
Mhm.
were a couple hundred miles away from Washington that day.
Yeah.
They had not been in touch with John Wilkes Booth for weeks. They couldn't possibly have known anything about the assassination, yet they were given very extreme sentences for
Yeah.
allegedly plotting to kill the president. Yet that diary was withheld from the trial. We only know about it because Lafayette Baker revealed it in his 1867 book about the history of the Secret Service. By the way,
Yeah.
Lafayette Baker was then killed at the age of 41 from what his doctor thought were symptoms of arsenic poisoning. So, it didn't pay to go in against the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. He was very quickly killed after revealing this diary. But the diary proves that there was a much larger conspiracy, and what
Yeah.
those missing pages would reveal would be incredible. And even the FBI's own forensic report from 1877 says yes, if these pages could be matched to the stubs we have with the remnants of John Wilkes Booth diary, it would reveal a great deal.
Yeah.
Um, but that's one of the important things to know about the Lincoln assassination was that the War Department, which had control of John Wilkes Booth refused to acknowledge his existence, and when it was acknowledged, they removed 86 pages so that no one could know what really Booth had to say.
James, it's an incredible story. And listen, folks, I mean, I had the pleasure of reading the book myself, and it's packed with information. And as you said, James, I mean, I do think you succeed in blowing apart the official narrative of what happened back then, and you've done it in forensic detail. It's a really gripping read. I have to say, I am a big fan of your writing. I do have beside me here on my bookshelf, I've got other books which you will recognize. Tornado and yeah, I got that one, and I got the case against Darwin, and I love all your stuff, and obviously we've done the stuff in the Lusitania. So look, James, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. Please support James. Follow him over on X. There's his X platform. You can find him there. There's James's website, bookmark it, and follow him there. Buy his book and just acquaint yourself with history. I mean, as I said, James, the older I get, the thing I have become very awakened to is the fact that the official version of history is really the thing that starts the investigation. It doesn't conclude it. And there's so many topics we could talk about that fall into that category. But this is an excellent book, folks. I do urge you to acquaint yourself with really what did happen on that fateful evening back in April of 1865 to an American president. It turns out he wasn't the last American president to meet such a fate. But let's hope there are no future ones, particularly in the imminent future. So, James, great to see you again, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on with me and speak to our audience, and do appreciate that. And as I say, really enjoyed the book. Are there any forthcoming? Are you working on anything else? Can I ask just before we finish?
Well, I'm working on a blog post on the Trump administration, which raises a lot of questions about where Trump is headed. I just wanted to mention, though, if you really want to have a fantastic show, I know you have a UK audience, we could talk about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. And we could explore some gaping holes in what Americans think about those events. I've written on that more than 10 years ago, but that would be a fantastic topic for your UK audience, because the American Revolution was not what Americans believe it was. I will say that much. Well, I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, where the shot or heard around the world was fired.
Yeah. Well, that sounds. James, what we'll do, we'll make sure we bring you back and we can talk. I am familiar with that story, and that's a mind blowing one as well. I mean, but this is. But James, what we're really we're putting out truths out there, and you're exposing stuff which needs to be exposed. People need to open their minds and suddenly and recognize if there's anything we've learned, conscious of the fact we're on YouTube over the recent years. Let's just call it recent years, and that is that critical thinkers don't just accept everything that they're told. So I'll say it no more strongly than that, because I don't want to get another strike if I can avoid it. But James, you'll be very welcome back again. And again, so thank you so much for your time. From James and myself, folks, thanks all of you who have listened, watched this, wherever it's been. And I shall return. I'll back on Monday. There's a live show. There's a live podcast tomorrow night. Back on Monday to discuss the very woke Jaguar ad. I don't know if this is the whole woke thing, James, and how prestigious car brands are just being destroyed from within by embracing the kind of wokery and all of that. So we're back with another friend of the platform on Monday night. So folks, we'll see you then. But that's it from James and myself for tonight. Good night.